Welcome back to Consilience Conversations, Episode 5. And back with me is my esteemed colleague and friend, Dr. Matthew Roos. Welcome back.
Thanks, Alex. How you doing this week?
I'm doing really well, and I'm finally feeling better. My voice is mostly back. I'm about to share the screen now and show the PowerPoint that we had last time. And, as these conversations go on, it's like we have more and more to say about fewer and fewer things. And so I think it's a good sign, and also a fun sign that we as we talked about in the pre-show, we have so much to talk about.
Yeah, these episodes, we're finding ourselves cut off after the sort of allotted time, where I think episode 1, it was sort of back and forth, and we didn't know how it was going to go. But now I hope our listeners agree that we actually have conversations that are have some interesting content once in a while, surprisingly.
Yeah, and something the listeners should know is we appreciate that we essentially doubled the amount of you this last month, and you can always donate to the Anchor page if you want to, and then we can pay Dr. Matt Roos to be on here, and that'd be nice. That'd be nice to give a little.
Yes, the required amount is extremely low, Alex, as you discovered. So, but I'm sure it could be put to other good use for you, from your listeners and for your show generally.
All right. Well, so what we wanted to talk about today, as usual, we have sort of a pastiche. I definitely wanted to ask you about the cognitive bias that we didn't get to last time, motivated reasoning. But even before that, I mentioned to you that I was pretty interested in your example of cognitive dissonance reduction from the PowerPoint here, and Jock Paintsep's 7 fundamental emotional states. And just to kind of lay it out for something we can talk about today or next time, we're also reading through this work, The Coddling of the American Mind by Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, a First Amendment lawyer and a social psychologist in reverse. And we read this chapter, Intimidation and Violence, from The Coddling of the American Mind. And there were 2 concepts I was going to ask you about potentially, which were collective dramatic action in preparation for a unified social action. So like rituals of like praying together, or what the All Blacks do before they take the field in rugby, or like a football team that like sort of jumps in a huddle together and starts jumping up and down. Football teams do that too. And also sort of the neurocircuitry of the claim that words can do violence. Broadly, that was what we sort of laid out. But that might be a couple shows, so where would you like to start?
Well, we can go wherever you'd like. I would say, so I read that chapter yesterday, and the examples you gave with the sort of religious rituals that are also similar to sporting rituals. Actually, that wasn't in that chapter, so you might have touched on that in the subsequent chapter, perhaps. Maybe. But nonetheless, we talked about it just a little bit before the show, so I'm happy to sort of speculate on that as best I can do. But
thank you.
The aspects of words as violence, if you will, or speech as violence, I thought that was very interesting. I think it's and you've brought up the term concept creep quite a bit, and that is another sort of form of that is one exemplar of a concept creep, where it used to be that we would, when someone said violence, they meant physical violence, and that was pretty well understood. And I think they give an example in the book of when we talk about nonviolent offenders, that is criminals, or those who have at least been charged, we clearly mean those who have not physically harmed anyone. But concept creep, this is an example of where now violence has gone from meaning physical harm to, at least in some people's interpretation, emotional harm. And there's even more tenuous connections where someone might say, well, if you do enough emotional harm to someone, maybe there is physical harm too, in the form of repeated stress and, sort of the toll that takes on the body. So, where would you like to, launch the discussion on it from here?
Well, so my question is, I suppose a claim that one might make is that if emotional pain uses the same brain circuitry as physical pain, then from a phenomenological level or an experiential level or even a neuropsychological level, they are the same. And so then one would have a physical basis for saying words could do violence. But if that's not true, and we do have that research, well, it seems like that's wrong. And well, that's
Yeah.
something I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to catch the humanities up, catch their theories up with the things we actually know due to empirical science now.
Mm-hmm. I think it's an awesome question, really great question or topic for discussion. And I haven't done any sort of homework or review on this.
Yeah.
I would, the first order answer is yes, there is some relationship between areas of the brain that might be activated by physical harm and those that might be activated by, emotional harm. It's hard to say what you mean by that, or
Yes.
not you, but generally. So there can be, at least my, passive readings. This is not an area of study for me, but now that's far cry from saying that they are identical neurally.
Oh.
So emotional harm. First of all, this is a lot of this is speculation, but you can imagine it comes in various forms. So if you are physically assaulted, the pain is immediate, right? It is incontrovertible. It's just there.
Yeah.
If it's an emotional harm, so again, that can perhaps be related. Sometimes it's more about a persistent infliction of, so you may be, if it's just once, if it may not really harm you. It may not even sort of activate that same circuitry or portions, some sub-portion of that circuitry. But my feeling is that, my guess is that with repeated sort of emotional attacks or attacks upon your emotion, you might see more and more neural activation. And I'm talking really about, the evidence for this is probably almost completely from fMRI or MRI studies, and fMRI studies, that's functional MRI, showing this sort of work. Although I would imagine it'd be hard to, if you or I just get into the physical scanner, that is the MRI machine, what is your approach as a researcher to emotionally harm me? And of course, as a volunteer subject, I would have signed up for this. Although people sign up for studies where they are physically harmed too, of course, right? The pain levels are kept to a reasonable amount. But now emotional harm, it may be that this seems like it would be a perhaps unethical approach to this sort of experiment, but you might want someone who's already experienced some sort of emotional harm and they're seeking treatment, and would they be willing to sort of undergo these studies where they are actually sort of emotionally assaulted a small bit, so we can see what their neural reaction is. So I guess the other thing, before I just start talking away and letting this get away from myself, one thing that I had put a pin in and want to mention is that it may be that there's another contrast between emotional harm and physical harm. In my mind, is that the physical harm is again, it's not only is it nearly instantaneous. It's, unless you're a Buddhist monk, you are probably unable to ignore that physical harm, to have that pain go away. There's a level of extreme. Some of us have perhaps a higher threshold for pain than others, and perhaps we can learn that to some extent or train ourselves to that to some extent. But I think the emotional harm, and this relates, I think, to a lot of some of the content in the chapter that we were reading. It's sort of a choice as to whether to allow that to harm you or not. And this also connects back to this sort of antifragile aspect. So if you are not emotionally harmed periodically, a small amount, you may never build up a sort of neural resistance to stronger emotional attacks. And we talk about emotional attacks. I don't know if that's really, or I'm talking about it, but maybe that's not the right terminology. The emotions are actually what are provoked. And so someone could insult you or say something to you that is counter to your belief. And what your emotional reaction is to that speech is a different story. But so maybe it's if you are able to in small doses take those insults or those thoughts that are opposed, that seem in opposition to your thinking, and build up a resistance to them, which doesn't mean you are just ignoring them. You may hear them and sort of consider them and take them into your sort of overall schema or a consciousness of people's thoughts, but that doesn't mean they cause you emotional harm. So,
well, that strikes me as exactly the point. I mean, you answered many of the questions that were popping up to me as you were talking. So I think your narrative was it was perfect. You were answering each question as it came up. And that was exactly what I wanted to ask, whether there was more of a cognitive element to so-called emotional or so-called and ill-defined emotional harm, and as opposed to physical harm. And then you touched on the training aspect that, if you're physically strong and you get punched in the chest, you experience less pain than somebody who is physically weaker and gets punched with the same motive force. And that there might be sort of an element of exposing your emotions or exposing yourself to that which disarrays your emotions. I think you made that distinction.
Right.
So that you become more robust, or rather even stronger than robust, says Nassim Taleb, antifragile, so that your mind, or your consciousness, whatever you want to call it, that which has to tend to your emotions, move things like right hemisphere to left hemisphere, needs to get sort of practice dealing with emotional disarray in order to become stronger as a system.
Right. I think that's there's this one interject one statement, which is I like how your terminology, emotional disarray, and so there. Yeah, I guess I had mentioned someone may make some sort of statement, and you learn what sort of emotions to allow yourself to what emotions are elicited by that statement. But even you may also learn that there's sort of the next level, which is I think your term emotional disarray is a good way to coin it. If but then there are still going to be sometimes that your emotions are going to be fired up in some way, but that doesn't mean you still need to have that happen sometimes to learn how to deal with those emotions,
right? And
to learn how to calm them down, think logically, think critically, and don't just let your emotions drive your behavior.
Well, it sounds like, and this is a point Dante makes in the Purgatorio, just get that reference in there, that the more situations you are forced to adapt to, or that you will willingly allow yourself to be put in order to adapt as a human, right? Like we will actually put ourselves in situations in which we attempt maximal adaptation that are necessary, like learning how to figure skate or learning how to fly fish, right? Those
or how to be a public speaker, these things could be, sorry, I would just wanted to throw that one in there because that's one where it's not a physical thing. You're not taking on any physical task. You just are, it's something that you're averse to, and but you got to step in there, and you're never going to be good at it or even okay at it unless you try it and get over those those fears. And
be about that being that you do not only adapt to that specific behavior, but to the symbolic behavior behind it, or which is you adapt to being able to confront that which you fear and are not good at, and acquire the skill necessary to more master that domain, and then thus extend your range of competency. And not only that, but your ability to become competent in the future as well. And well, I mean, that really makes me want to ask to what extent dopamine is necessary in the production of that sort of habit. And when you are pursuing the acquisition of skill in order to adapt to a new environment, like you're learning how to swing so you can be a better baseball player, right? That has very little use outside of the baseball arena, except for the fact that the better you get at learning a new skill, the better you get sort of at mastering any domain you're in, rather than just the specific domains that you've already mastered.
Sure. Sometimes that's you're learning to learn as well. We all often, throughout life, you may not. So you follow it up in your baseball example. You may learn how to swing, and you may, if all you do is focus on learning how to swing, well, that you probably will not have learned a general form of learning. But if you're if you're a gifted athlete, or even if you're not, but you just love sports and you go out and you try to learn lots of different sports movements, you will of course get better at those movements, but you will probably get, if there's another one, then you try a new sport that you've never tried before, 5 years down the road, you will probably learn that one more quickly than you would have had you not learned those other sports.
Well, then I think this is the damning piece of evidence against sort of the words is violence argument, because here it is. If you are a young and therefore most likely sort of fragile and weak thinker, and I say something that identifies me as outgroup for you, whatever that happens to be, and you label me using a cognitive distortion, which might just be called a novice level mistake of thought, that with generalized applicability to people, then, and you label me, and then you experience negative emotion because of my presence, because I have identified myself as differing from you. Well, how that's going to be, people are, depending on what in-groups you're in, which I can't possibly see if I'm a non-judgmental, non-discriminating person, and even if I am, it's impossible to see all the in-groups you're a part of, and like say who your family is, and all of these sorts of things about you. I can't see inside of you either. There's a lot I just don't know. But how is it possible for anybody ever during speaking or even just manifesting their being not to identify themselves as in some way outgroup to somebody they're talking to? How could they possibly know enough to do that? It becomes impossible at that point, it sounds
well like. It's certainly, you could take the flip side of that, and say if you are speaking with someone and that person somehow is, getting back or connecting this a little bit to what you were asking about or suggesting about, sort of forming of habits and perhaps even dopamine's connection to this. If that other person is, if their cognitive habit is to look for characteristics in someone that they're speaking with to identify them as an outgroup person, whether that's a specific outgroup, sort of, or this sort of like, which may fall in this sort of like common identity, common enemy identity politics, which I think is quite prevalent today. You as the, so that's sort of, there may be nothing that you can do to prevent that person from, very little you can do to prevent that person from sort of moving along their typical habit of thought formation, unfortunately. So I think, when I think we touched on this last time a little bit, and so I can only speculate on it, but when talking about, we talked about dopamine and how that relates to sort of habit formation, and, motor movements are the easiest examples of that, and we talk about habits, and that can be movement habits too, where if you've learned to do something one way physically, it can be hard to break that habit, even if you're very conscious of it. What I don't know, but I suspect may be true, is that we may have cognitive habits too. And what I really mean by that is sort of approaches to the world and my thinking about it. And if you are if you learn a habit early that you should always be looking for someone to impose upon your safety, or that they are being violent with their words, if that's all you look for, then you may form that habit early on. And whether that's the same sort of neural process as motor habits that creates that, I don't know, but that may be part of what's happening. And we all know those habits are hard to break.
Well, and if you build that habit and don't build the habit for learning additional robustness by maximizing or just increasing your adaptive capabilities and your domain of competence, then you're going to stick to that small domain of competence, which is that fear response, that childish response, right? That appeal to some authority outside of oneself with no recourse to reason, simply because one feels a certain way. Then you're going to sort of just keep using that adaptation, and it's going to manifest in your behavior. And so something very interesting about the gray paper that we read was that it seemed to be saying to me, and I have a very general sense of this because it was very complex science in there, is that when you develop a physical habit, dopamine is released during each micro part or micro routine within the habit in order to facilitate doing the thing effortlessly over time. And is that
yes.
correct?
Well, so dopamine has multiple roles, and as you mentioned, it's very complex, but and so that's why neuroscientists are many of them are still continuing to say this. I think there's two key things. One is that it does sort of, it is there to ensconce certain behaviors in a way that makes them easier to perform, that you don't have to think about them consciously as much, or you need less cognitive effort to execute those physical movements, and then probably also perhaps also cognitive actions or behaviors as well. But it's not only for, and so I talk about that as like modulates learning. I think I put on our notes there. It enhances the plasticity between certain neural connections and allows this sort of like a stronger circuit to emerge, so you can do these things quickly and easily without too much effort.
Okay, on that point, just to pause it there, just because I think this might have some take of it, is then if you've developed those pathways and sort of increased those pathways and sort of lubricated them so that it is easier to access them in terms of your thinking, which is then manifested in your behavior, which is seeking to make somebody in front of you a threat to get them away from you, then it strikes me that is like, and it's funny we got back here, like an addiction to a way of thinking that manifests behavior, because it has been rewarded so often by being used so often that it has become sort of the sole adaptation in thinking and behavior to the world.
A great connection. First of all, again, this is somewhat speculation. It's not somewhat, lots of speculation here about how some of these cognitive biases and some of the things that we're discussing could be related to this reward system and dopamine's role there. But the one thing that came right to my mind when you mentioned that is what people call calling out. So shaming or calling out someone,
yes,
for taking some action or saying something that may have been intended to be harmful to another person, but oftentimes it's so slight that either it was not intended to mean anything negative, or it actually didn't mean anything negative. It's just that you, the judger of this, are so sensitive to it that you're the one that's like sort of overly sensitive to it. So that I could see is perhaps you might feel rewarded by having called out someone or shamed someone in that manner. And that certainly could fall under the purview, or potentially could fall under the purview of sort of an addictive, that you're sort of addicted to that. And it gives you, gambling is an addiction too. And so maybe shaming people is, some people might be in some sense addicted to that.
Well, let's talk about that, because if that has become my mode of adaptation, and I discover that, and I just taught about entering the purgatorio today and sort of the process of recognition of sin. And I want to connect this to the breaking of a bad habit, which we have down here, and how to actually break a bad habit. Because the idea in the purgatorio is you have to recognize it first. It's sort of a Catholic idea, but not a religious version. I think it's actually just a very symbolic and useful idea that is probably right. First, you have to recognize the bad habit. Then you have to deal with the emotional pain of, changing your map of yourself, because you are no longer like perfect avatar in the world, but like imperfect human. And then you have to put in the work, or the sacrifice, the effort and the time to improve upon your imperfection. That's also a point that Plato makes in the Meno, that it's only when you realize your imperfections that you're motivated to work on them. And so
it reminds me a bit of Alcoholics Anonymous, and they have 12 steps. I like that. That's too many steps for me to to recall, but that's that sounds like a real abbreviated version of that in some sense.
Yeah. So, I want to talk. Well, I guess I want to ask you then about how it is that one starts to replace a bad habit with a good habit. Because when we get into the Purgatorio with Dante, he has the proud who look down on people, bent over by the rock they stood on in order to look down on people, so that now they have to look up to everybody. And so Dante's sort of idea there, and they have to look up to these images of humility with a funny inversion there, that and then down on images of pride. And so there's sort of a Christian inversion there. But his idea seems to be that one changes one's perspective, or one's habit of perceiving and acting in a certain way in the world, by sort of overcorrecting to the other angle. So if you've been looking down, you need to be bent over so you can look up, so you can attain a balanced perspective. And
Mm-hmm.
I just thinking, I'm just wondering in terms of like the neuroscience of replacing a bad habit with a good habit, is it the case that your bad habit still exists, but your new habit becomes stronger, or that one becomes weaker while one becomes stronger? Can you wipe out the circuitry that you've developed for a bad habit, like a cocaine addiction, or being a part of a shame culture, or what? I just want to understand this a little more.
Yeah, well, my recollection from my early days of studying these matters is that to a degree, it's very difficult to sort of remove a habit. And I'll give you a sort of more concrete example.
Yeah.
So again, I will just take it back to sort of a motor example. So maybe a player is very good, or they're good, and they become very accustomed to taking a certain baseball swing, like you suggested, but they need to break that habit because there are better ways they can move, or perhaps the way they move is actually it gives them a great swing or a very powerful swing, but it's more damaging to their body, right? So they need to learn a more ergonomic way to swing. So they work on that, and they work on that, and they work on that, and of course, the way you might have to break any habit of that sort is you're thinking very consciously about how you're moving your body and repeating it again and again and again. And times when you're successful, there's some little bit of reward, and that is, dopamine represents the value there, and that promotes the learning of that new circuit. But to get to your point, to my understanding, it's very hard for that old circuit to go away.
Okay.
And maybe it can, and maybe this is definitely out of my realm generally, but the sort of anecdotal example that perhaps many people might be able to relate to is that it's going to be very easy to go back to that old habit. And so if you had truly erased it to the point where it was if you had never learned it, well, then it would be hard for you to then relearn that previous old bad swing, and unlearn your new ergonomically friendly swing. So it is hard to break habits, and not only hard to break them, it's hard to prevent them from reemerging. What is that to say? Is that a good analogy for cognitive habits and things that may be detrimental cognitive habits like we're discussing? I'm not sure, but it seems like a possibility.
Well, I just have a couple things to say about that. I think that's an excellent example, and it also explains why sort of regression to an earlier psychological state makes sense, because you're actually literally regressing to an earlier neurological state, or a state of former adaptation that is no longer a current adaptation.
Are you talking about in the context of sort of like the Dante notion about how to sort of overcome your negative behaviors or characteristics?
Yes, but why it's also easy if, say, you're stressed or tired, to act more like a child, because you have so much time built in of acting like a child, or your former, sort of like we talked about last time about how there's a neurological element to personality, how those former parts of your personality that maybe you don't use anymore. Maybe you used to whine, you don't whine anymore. You used to appeal to authority, but now you're an expert, and so you use your head a little more.
I'll call out that real quickly, and not call out in the way we've been using the term previously, but using your head more. So, you get tired, and it may just be part of it is that as we not only age, partially as we age, because our frontal lobe, the cortex, sort of our executive function cortex, develops further, well, even into our 20s. That develops more, but also those that have had more life experiences. And so some people may have had a wider variety of both positive and negative life experiences earlier in life. Other people may take longer across their life to accumulate some of those. But yeah, if you're tired, if you're cranky, it may be because you are just unable to put forth the motivation to utilize your frontal lobe as much as you might otherwise. And that's sort of like those habits that may have been formed may come out, ones that you might actually suppress otherwise. And also, your raw emotional state is more easy. It's that is less likely to be inhibited as well.
Well, that's so interesting because just I had Aristotle for us the other day, and I know that this is not technically his quote. This is an internet version of his quote, that excellence is a habit, but he does make a distinction between, in his ethics, habits and actions, that essentially one's habits are the result of one's accumulated actions. And so one should strive to not only input the best possible actions into one's habits, but have also the best possible habits. And it sounds like from what
is he saying? So it sounds to me, sorry, I like that was interesting, but your accumulated actions lead to your habits, or are what form your habits. But so it sounds to me that, this is a question. So from I guess I would ask Aristotle if he were here, but I'll ask you. So what do you mean by, you can choose your actions? Well, we'd like to think that we can choose our actions, and those accumulated actions will lead to habits. But then you said the words accumulated are the habits that the habits that we choose or act upon, or I didn't quite follow that. It's almost, by that first description, it sounds like we can't choose which habits we have, although we can choose which actions we take, which will probabilistically determine which habits that we have.
Well, right. So some habits, like he puts forward the idea of a habit of excellence. Mm-hmm. And so you can sort of choose that how you're going to practice whatever it is that you practice. And some things you do choose to practice, right? Like if you want to play an instrument or play a certain sport or something like that. Not every habit, of course. Mm-hmm. But that since you sort of become your habits, and it sort of seems like neurologically, like you sort of die into your habits because your fluid IQ becomes your crystallized IQ. You're talking about accumulated knowledge. Mm-hmm. That it is really in your best interest to build the best possible habits into yourself, because that is what you essentially become and are, plus whatever fluid IQ you have at whatever time you're there.
Right. That could take us to another conversation, but we'll save that for another time. But I think there's some perhaps truth to that, and you see that largely as people age into senior citizenship, but actually well beyond, where a lot of their actions do seem to be more of habit than sort of fluid thinking. And so, sure, I'd sure like to have excellence as a habit as I age versus, I don't know what the opposite of excellence is, but poor performance.
Vice, yeah, something. Yeah, exactly. Well, and as a kid, being told to practice right and how it wouldn't just magically make me better to practice poorly. If I'd known some of this, it would have been helpful. And also just telling kids not to do things like take drugs or, sell themselves short or not put in the best effort. It's like you are actually building a little system into your brain that will automate. And is this the sort of behavior you want to be a part of your character for the rest of your life? And that has nothing to do with what I want for you. And that is just a real question that you might want to answer. And I can help you, as a teacher, my idea then would be like, if you choose what I think is the best thing for you to choose, then I can help you. But, you're going to have to put in some work, because this is you. It's actually what you become.
So what, we'll go into your profession quickly. As a teacher, is there a certain age range that you think that sort of discussion would be most effective, or a certain age range very well be very ineffective?
I definitely know. So I teach mostly freshmen and sophomores. I've taught some juniors and seniors and adults as well, but mostly them. I think the freshmen are ready to hear it. The sophomores need to hear it. Because, I teach multiple levels, honors levels and general levels. And there's a difference in attitude between them. And one of the problems is that it's sort of a capitalistic problem. The honor students are not only highly intelligent, they're highly conscientious. They have great habits that their parents have helped them with. And so with the general students, they're often, and I don't distribute IQ tests, but around as smart as the honor students, but they don't have the same motivation, which I think is tied to B, the fact that they don't have the same level of good habits that enable them to feel differently about school, because they're getting the positive rewards of they're reaping the rewards of success, of excellence, right? Like they're getting A's all the time, and that's shooting their status up in like teachers' eyes, and that's shooting their dopamine levels up, and also from what I hear, serotonin levels as well. And so they're getting all this positive reward, whereas my general level students, and I think this is often, and this is the problem with, like, say, the teacher-parent relationship, that the teacher can teach some skills and help with some things, but many of the good habits that make a student successful in the classroom are built into the kid by the parent. And that is something that I would really like parents to know.
Yeah, and they probably need to know that right away, early on.
Yeah. I mean,
unfortunately, if they don't have it themselves, they may not be able or willing or desiring to sort of teach that.
See, and that's a problem too, right? And there's a Freudian element to that too, which is, can you deal with your kid being more successful than you or better than you are at something? Even though evolutionarily, of course, that is the whole point, which is something I try to express to the kids. It's like, you are supposed to be better than I am and to have more than I have. The fact that your parents complain about you having more is a good thing, not a bad thing. And that's what you're expected to pay forward. And it's like, yeah.
Oh, let me just kind of make one comment there that came up that I thought about while you were a few minutes ago, is that we've talked sometimes about we all know, I think it's probably pretty self-evident, but it's also been shown through studies that people, they need to feel like they're part of a group. Typically, they need to feel like they're part of a group, and especially when you're younger, it may be that what that group is about and their actual opinions isn't what really matters. It's that you are sort of accepted. And of course, some people, and they take actions or express opinions that are fit within that group's sort of collective thought, and that then they are positively accepted in that group and rewarded for it, and rewarded in the way that you described, where you were describing a group of teachers and educated parents, or parents that value that and sort of reward their students or their children through that, but also their peers. They are often going to be hanging around other students that have that sort of same mindset. And so this goes back to just the old adage of you don't want your kid hanging around with the wrong group or that other kid. And it's unfortunate, but there's some truth to that, because when they're hanging out with that other group, if you will, they may feel like they're part of that group. That makes them feel good, so they're going to continue taking on actions and thoughts that endear them to that group, and perhaps at the expense of sort of opening up their mind more and working hard in school.
And well, that actually ties to another part of Aristotle's ethics, which is the friendship of the good, because it strikes me that then the people you choose to make into your in-group, the people you befriend, are people who share similar sort of habits to you, and probably they form those in relation to similar goals to you. Like, say, if you're both good swimmers, you both have the goal of becoming better swimmers or of winning in swimming competitions. And thus the friendship of the good, or like the habit of excellence, would be based on loving somebody who has the habit of excellence, or the desire to cognitively tweak that which one is attempting in order to optimize it habitually. And that sort of the ultimate friendship, therefore, just in sort of regular language, not whatever that crazy articulation was, would be to hang around people who want the best for themselves and for you, and are willing to work for it, and do work for it, and do their best. And then, yeah.
Well, you got a key point there. They want the best for themselves and also for you.
Right.
We all want the best for ourselves. Let's be honest about it. Some people are happy to get the best for them. Truly, they think they can get the best for themselves at the detriment to others. Sort of a zero-sum game where others don't quite see it that way.
Yeah, no, and the economists like Francis Fukuyama say that trust is actually our highest commodity in the West, and that it makes us rich. And so it's very interesting to think that if I make myself rich with a concern for making you rich, we both get richer. And
it's generally shown that doesn't mean you can't get rich by focusing on number one to the detriment of others, but it's we would like to think, or I would like to think, that it's less likely than if you collectively work towards something, a common goal.
Well, there seems to be some research that that is true. And so, I know we had a lot to talk about today, Matt, Dr. Roos, but I know I've taken a lot of your time, and
I've been happy to give the time, Alex.
yeah, yeah. Well, just to give the listeners a preview, we're going to have our mutual friend, the person who first hooked us up together, Mr. Daniel Babcock, on just before Thanksgiving to talk about what we promised we would never talk about, or we hoped never to talk about, free will. He's going to come and light us up.
Right. And I thought I was going to be free to not have this conversation, but apparently I have to do it. So, there's one other piece of evidence that we do not have free will.
Perfect. Babcock better listen to this so that he's ready for what's coming. All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Roos.
Had a great time, Alex. Thanks.